Hello, and welcome everyone to today's webinar with the America-Israel Friendship League. Welcome everyone to today's webinar with the America-Israel Friendship League. My name is Naomi Reinhardt. I am the Chief Development Officer of AIFL, and I am currently in New York, and I am delighted to be hosting today's webinar with Lori Kaufman and Jonathan Price. Lori is an author based in Israel in Ra'anana, and Jonathan is with the Department of Classics and the Department of History at Tel Aviv University. And as always, we're delighted to have our guests joining us from Israel and the United States and around the world, both on Zoom and Facebook Live. Can you please write in the chat or on Facebook where you're calling in from and what brings you to our webinar today? And if you have read this wonderful new book, Rebel Daughter, which we will be discussing today with its author. I was just telling Lori that I read a ton of nonfiction. That's usually my go-to, but this wonderful novel just blew me away, and I've been reading it on planes and beaches and anytime I can get a second. And it really goes by fast, and it's a gripping tale. So delighted to be discussing it today. And I see people already joining in from all over. And later on in the conversation, of course, we'll have time for your questions and comments. So if you have read the book, please let us know how you heard about it, what you thought of it, and where you're planning to do your summer reading now that we're having some warmer weather and we can go read outside and parks and anywhere else that you'd like as the weather gets a little warmer. So let's start with Lori, and please let us know a little bit about yourself. You have an interesting background. You did not start your career as an author. You came to it at age 61, I believe, after...
I came to it at age 50, but the book was published at 61.
Exactly. But you went to Princeton, you went to Harvard Business School. How did you decide to write a book like this after such a career?
Well, I always say that the story found me. I didn't find the story. I can either thank Jonathan or blame him, depending on what mood I'm in. He was involved in a project with academicians from many universities to catalog the inscriptions of the ancient world. And he was the one that told me about the archaeological discovery that inspired me to write the book. It was a 2,000-year-old gravestone of a Jewish woman discovered in southern Italy. And the story of the woman was that she was captured after the destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of the Second Temple in the 1st century, sold as a slave in Rome, and freed by her owner, who fell in love with her. And this was just such an incredible story that Jonathan told me. I immediately wanted to know more. And that's what led to my whole transition from a consultant to the high-tech industry in Israel to trying my hand at writing. So I guess the short answer is it's Jonathan's fault.
And had this been of interest to you before? I mean, during your prior career, was this something that you had considered? Had you ever written before? Had you ever studied this part of our history?
I always wanted to write, but I was not interested in, and I've loved historical fiction, but for me, historical fiction ended at World War I, World War II, maybe the Civil War, because I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, so I could stretch it, but I never really thought about the 1st century. But the story of this woman was so fascinating, and I wanted to know more. And when I started reading, I was just pulled in, because the 1st century is such a exciting, momentous era, not just in Jewish history, but in all of human history. And it's the time when the survival of the Jewish people was at stake, and the birth of Christianity, and the effects of what happened in those few years are still being felt by us today. So I'd say it swept me up. The more I learned, the more I wanted to learn, and it became a bit of an obsession, I think, which turned into a writing project, which turned into a book.
And when you say 10 years, can you describe a little bit about that process of what took place over those 10 years?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of waiting for Jonathan to call me back to answer my questions. He was always off to some other conference or had a deadline for another paper. But as soon as I decided I wanted to write a historical novel, I knew that I wanted to tell it as accurately as I could and to bring this story and these real people to life as authentically as I could. So I worked with world-class historians, not just Jonathan, but other archaeologists and experts in many, many different fields to check everything. And it was a 10-year process because there was a lot to learn. And I wanted, like I said, I really wanted to get it right. I felt such an obligation, not only to the real life characters whose story I was telling, but also to my readers. When I read a book, historical fiction, the first thing I want to know afterwards is how much is really true. And I felt like I wanted to give the readers a chance to go back in time. That's what I always fantasize about, is time travel. And to do that, you really have to know what it felt like to walk through the streets of first century Rome. I mean, and Jerusalem, which were both this settings of the novel. How did the light hit the stones of the temple, and what was the temperature like, and what did people eat, and just so many details. And as soon as I thought that I understood what it was really like, I'd learned something else. So it was really a long process. I had some great sources though too. Jonathan will talk more about Josephus, which is the main source that I used for most of the history. He was an eyewitness account of what went on those years. And then I read probably hundreds of books and conference proceedings and scholarly dissertations. I even read a conference proceeding on first century garbage dumps. It's amazing what you can learn from what people throw out. And of course, the archaeology. Living in Israel, I could go to the sites. I could walk on the same stones that my characters walked on. And that gives you chills when you think about, but it's all here.
I assume you spent a lot of time in Jerusalem for your research. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of trips back and forth.
Yeah.
And you described the protagonist as a woman, but she's really a child or a teenager.
The book opens when she's 14 and until she's reaches 19 or 20. Mm-hmm. And it's, those 4 to 5 years of her life. And so it's also a bit of a coming of age story, but primarily about her struggle to take charge of her life against overwhelming odds. Yeah. And the thing that kept amazing me was that this was a true story. I mean, I had to bring a lot of imagination to it to flesh it out, but we know basically the trajectory of her life. It was a young woman who was from Jerusalem, who ended up being captured, sold as a slave, and then became free again in Rome. I mean, I just wanted to know, what was that like? I tried to imagine her life. Well, we think of history so often in such broad terms, the geopolitical implications or sociological situations, tensions between, for example, the aristocrats and the poor people, or rural and urban. But when you look at history through the eyes of just one person, it's a completely different perspective. What was it like to live through these events? And what did they eat for dinner? It's just a different way of looking at our history.
Yeah, and it is interesting, having lived in Jerusalem when I was a young kid. It is really nostalgic to think of what it would be like to go and walk on those streets as so long ago, and our people's history of what it was like to live there. Like you said, both in the grand scale as well as on all the little things that you hear in the novel, from her, her household chores to her conversations with her mom and her dad, and her loves and her other interests. And by the way, we promise there'd be no spoiler alerts for those who have not yet read the book or finished it. We will not give away the ending in this.
Right.
So let's turn it over to Jonathan. If you can share with us a little bit about first century Jerusalem and how this novel brings that period alive in a creative but also authentic way.
Sure. I think all those words are true. It is creative and authentic and imaginative. In fact, I'm very happy to take the blame for this book because I think it's a really a wonderfully creative enactment. It's one of the use of historical imagination. Historians who work with dry facts and dusty texts and dusty sites day after day sometimes forget that they have to use their imagination to fill in the many gaps, especially in ancient history. This 2,000 years, the further away you get from us, the more gaps that have to be filled in. And this is something that I think that professional historians must do as well. And Lori provided me the opportunity, for which I will be forever grateful, really to imagine what it was like and to fill in gaps of things that I knew or thought I knew. I've learned a lot from helping with this book as well. So you asked about first century Jerusalem, where Esther, the main character, was born and grew up. This is a fact, and it was wonderful to we know a lot about first century Jerusalem. We know how it was, the topography, how it was laid out. In fact, you can show a slide now because first of all, of Josephus. Josephus was a resident of Jerusalem. He was born in Jerusalem. He lived in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods of Jerusalem, and he gave us in book 5 of his account of the Jewish War a very detailed account, area by area, building by building, neighborhood by neighborhood of ancient Jerusalem. And this model is whoever's been in Jerusalem in the Israel Museum. There is a model, a physical model of first century Jerusalem based on both Josephus's detailed description of the ancient city and archaeological excavations. This is quite accurate. In fact, this model is changed as new excavations modify our knowledge of it. So it was possible to walk with Lori through the neighborhoods, through the streets, and see the buildings when we take the perspective of a teenage girl walking through the streets of the city that she knows quite well as the back alleys. It was also very instructive to try to imagine the city on 2 levels. First of all, the physical level, and second of all, sort of the human anthropological level. The physical level, again, as ancient historians, we rarely think about how it smelled to walk through cities, and the scenes that were not sort of the historical actors that we follow in our writings. So to walk through the city, and Lori brought to my attention that in fact a temple city, as Jerusalem of course was, would often be, depending on the way the wind was blowing, would often be filled with smoke. Here's the temple in the same physical model of Jerusalem at the Israel Museum, and so the city would be filled with smoke, and we would a resident walking through Jerusalem would smell rotting animals, and also the wonderful smells of the spice market, which you can experience today walking through the old city of Jerusalem. I think the old city of Jerusalem today smells a lot better than it did in ancient times. There's not the smoke, there's not the rotting carcasses, there's not refuse stored on the street. There's these wonderful spices, there are vegetable markets, and so forth. So just walking through the physical city, what you would see, hear, and smell really excited my imagination. It was possible to fill in many of these gaps based on what we know from Jerusalem, from sources, and also from parallels from other well-excavated ancient cities. But then we come to even the more interesting part, which is the human mosaic. Jerusalem in the first century was a cosmopolitan city. People came from all over the world, especially for the festivals, but all over the world. We know this from many ancient sources, including the Book of Acts, for example. Think of the Pentecost scene, and the Book of Acts, which describes dozens and dozens of nations. And so it was possible to imagine, what would Esther see? Well, she would see people from all over the world, which she would identify by their distinctive dress, or their distinctive languages, or their distinctive accents if they were trying to speak Hebrew or Aramaic. All this was true. Then, as she would walk through, she would see the whole complex mosaic of people who lived in Jerusalem, from high priests in their grand robes and colorful robes, and aristocrats who smell like perfume, maybe even reeking of perfume, to a lowly worker pushing a cart of wares through Jerusalem, to prophets, especially in the first century, especially in the decades leading up to the Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire. Jerusalem filled up more and more with prophets, messiahs, people prophesying the coming of the Messiah, political, more and more fanatical groups, and they were all in Jerusalem trying to spread their message, recruiting members, and they were very loud. They shouted to the public, they shouted at each other. This would be very exciting. And what was imagined, what it was like to be a child in Jerusalem and see all these things from sort of knee level up. It was all very exciting. And I think that Lori made the city come alive in a very real and historically plausible way just by having Esther running through the streets of Jerusalem, the alleys, tripping over things, smelling the beautiful flowers and spices, avoiding carcasses of dogs, choking on the smoke from the sacrifices now and then. It was a wonderful act of historical imagination.
Yeah, and you mentioned the cosmopolitan nature of the city of Jerusalem, but also the war and the violence. And why did Judea, which was a small remote province with no army to declare war on Rome, which was considered, the greatest empire that ever was?
Yes. This is a very good question, which I will try to answer in a couple of minutes, even though, of course, there are whole books, dissertations, and treatises written on this. The Jews had a lot to complain about, as did many subjects of the Roman Empire. Their taxes were high, but Jews actually had higher taxes because they paid both Jewish taxes, that is the tithes and so forth, as well as the Roman taxes. The Roman governors, the governors that were sent to Judea, housed in Jerusalem and Caesarea before the revolt, were particularly abusive for whatever reason. Some of them had a particular antipathy against Jews. But in addition to that, there were ways to handle these problems. There were channels through governors, through sending embassies to the emperor in Rome to solve problems, complaining against abusive governors and so forth. But the Jews as well were confident that against all odds, God would help them. Those who were true, deep believers believed that God would be on their side, and that numbers and physical odds did not really make any difference. And they had very near examples in history to support that belief. For example, the Maccabees. Whoever is listening and knows about the Hanukkah story, this is a story of an improbable victory of a small band of very poorly armed Jews against a huge empire, Syrian Greek empire, and they won. They won, you can explain it strategically, but the belief was they won because God believed in the justice of their cause. This was a time in the world in general, and in Judea in particular, when the expectation of the end of time was strong and growing stronger. The way local groups, individuals and groups read the Bible, interpreted particular verses of the Bible as predicting this is the time. In other words, it was the correspondence that they made between facts on the ground and truths in the texts. And they thought that this was the correct interpretation of the text, and this gave them enough inspiration to take up arms against the great Roman Empire. Many felt, for example, one interpretation was that all world history consists of 4 great empires, all destined to fall, and they will be knocked down by a 5th element. This is actually in the book of Daniel, and that will be, of course, the coming of the Messiah, and he will establish the sovereignty of Israel on earth. For many people, the facts on the ground were undeniably verification of this prophecy. So they felt this is the time. Now, the big controversy within the Jewish population was not whether the prophecy was true, because it was never doubted that it was true, but whether we had to wait for God to start the war, or whether we should start the war. And obviously, those who felt that we should start the war got the upper hand and started the war.
Wow. And had you ever worked with a novelist like this before? Was this the first time for you as well, doing this type of collaboration, or have you done this before?
This is absolutely the first time I've done this, and I have a great appreciation for historical novels, because I really think that fundamentally they do very similar things to what we professional historians who work with facts do, or must do. That is, imagining the gaps. Now, Lori, of course, as a novelist, imagined things that I wouldn't dare put in a scholarly article, like what was going through the heart and mind of a 14-year-old girl or 15-year-old when the war broke out against Rome, and what her relationship was like with her mother and so forth. But I think that the experience of working with a novel and trying to write a coherent story, in fact, was very much like the experience of an ancient historian. That's to say, somebody at the time, like Josephus, or historians writing in Greek and Latin, who were trying to reconstruct the history of their times as well. It gave me insight actually into what I would call the historiographical profession or process of antiquity. They wrote history very different from what we do. They wrote narratives. And working with somebody who was writing a narrative that tried to explain things, I think gave me insight into how historical writing started. Not just how I should act as a historian, filling in the gaps with my imagination, but also how ancient historians worked with their materials and filled in the gaps as well.
You never told me that. That is interesting.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that surprised me in all this process was, even though the world was so different and people believed that the world was coming to an end, and the apocalyptic beliefs and the belief in magic and the belief in physical resurrection when after people died, so many beliefs and that were so foreign to us. Yet at some level, people are the same. And that was very liberating when that clicked for me, because it gave me, I'd say, the self-confidence to put myself in someone else's shoes who lived 2,000 years ago. I think that human emotions are timeless, and it doesn't matter if you live today or if you lived 2,000 years ago. You want to protect your family, you want to live your life in freedom and dignity, and you want to find love. And those were things that I could put in a different historical framework, a different time. But I felt like that it was important to bring those elements to life. And I guess that's why the biblical stories still resonate today, because we still know about sibling rivalry and jealousy and all the other emotions that all the ancient stories capture. So that for me was my aha moment, that I actually could write this. And also having Jonathan there on the side to check all the history. For a beginning historical novelist, it's like bowling with bumpers. I knew he wasn't going to let me write anything that was totally wrong. And in retrospect, though, Jonathan, I have to say, you probably made me stay in a very narrow lane, because if Josephus said something happened in the morning and I wanted it to happen in the afternoon, it happened in the morning. I mean, there was so much we couldn't know that we had to imagine, but whatever we did know, we wanted to stick to the facts.
But I think you're actually pointing out one of the book's great strengths, Lori, which is that unlike many historical novels, which is a story, a human story told in the background of whatever century or place in the world it is, this is a story in which the narrative and the characters are driven by the historical events. There's a direct connection between what they do and what is done to them and what was actually happening in history. I think that's really one of the book's strengths, and I'm glad you or we succeeded in doing that. Let me also say that so far as those bumpers are concerned, I look at it from another point of view, because in a sense, my world expanded within the confines of those bumpers. Let me just give you one example, and this is almost embarrassing to say, but scholars can be rather narrow pinheads sometimes. And I know that when I was a graduate student a long time ago in the 80s, learning ancient history, we learned at the time as sort of standard knowledge, standard wisdom, that love in the ancient world was very different from love in the modern world. And this was based on very learned analyses of ancient texts like Plato and Seneca, the Stoics, and so forth. They didn't feel love the way we did. But the more I learned that, but the more I worked with sources and then actually worked with Lori and reread the sources, there's no reason to believe that. In fact, there's many reasons not to believe that. I do believe, especially after working with Lori in this book, that I've earned a very important corrective to some of the stuffy scholarly constructions that I learned as a student. So yeah, I truly believe what Lori just said, that human emotions, human desires were the same then as they are now. And in fact, one last comment on ancient historians, ancient historiography, they felt the same thing. In fact, one of my favorite historians from antiquity, Thucydides, the Greek historian, said that what he writes will be true so long as human nature remains the same. He thinks that human nature is the same from the beginning of human history to his day and afterwards. And he was a genius. Who am I to argue with him?
I think in many ways you're right. And one of the many things I love about this novel is that you intersperse both the huge questions of will her family survive and where is her brother who's lost at war and what will happen next with the Romans and the rebels, but also, should she marry this guy or that guy? And,
right.
Why doesn't her mom, give her a hug and can she spend more time with her dad and, the chores she has to do. So it's a really nice sort of combination of both of those large and small questions. And so much of the book is about love and her search for love and her desire for love, both from her family and from potential suitors and husbands. And I mean, I think, to put yourself in the mind of a 14-year-old girl who's going through those types of questions, those are not the questions that 14-year-olds have to deal with today. So it must have been, kind of a stretch to put yourself in that mindset.
She grew up fast. But as we know from traumatic tales of the 20th century, children grew up fast when they had to deal with issues of survival.
Yeah.
And Esther, historically, factually, was a survivor. We know where she was when. There's no doubt she had to find ways to survive in almost impossible circumstances. And she did, because she ended up in Italy.
Yeah. So in terms of, we're getting a lot of questions of how do you put yourself into someone's shoes from so long ago? And I think we've been touching on that. Was there anything else that surprised you in your research or that was difficult for you to sort of imagine, just with all the differences of what life was like back then versus now for both of you?
Well, for me, there were a lot of surprises, especially the belief systems, which I know that Jonathan spent years working and studying some of the inscriptions on the bone boxes that are scattered around Jerusalem. But that to me was fascinating, the whole burial customs of burying someone in a cave for a year and then going back a year later to save their bones in another box and rebury them so that when the person is resurrected, they'll have their bones, which obviously they need for their next life. And those beliefs and so many beliefs that I thought were not widespread, I find out were very widespread. And then after looking at all these, their way of looking at the world was so foreign and their beliefs were so foreign. And yet again, they were people, and there was still civil war and civil discord and fanaticism and all the things that people do when they're just acting in a human way, which is love and fight and get together when there's a bigger enemy. And that was also very surprising to me, how many parallels there really were with today's world, that even in spite of our advancements in science, and we don't look to magic in the same way that they did in the first century, or the afterlife, or so many of their beliefs that we know today were totally outmoded. Yet we're still dealing with the same types of conflicts. That was a little bit sobering.
Yeah. And also, how much do we know about the real Esther who lived so long ago? I mean, there was a few words, right, that were on the gravestone engraved on it. How much can we really glean from just a few words on a gravestone into this, almost 400-page novel?
Well, this goes back to our first meeting. And if that the stone will soon appear on your screen. This is the inscription that started the whole thing. And this is an epitaph, a tombstone. You can see her name. The left side is a little bit broken. You see her name at the very top line, Claudia. CL has fallen off, Claudia Aster. This is the name of the woman buried under the stone. And the next line says she's from Jerusalem. And the next line says she's a captive. She's a captive from Jerusalem. Now, in fact, I could give a whole lecture. In fact, I have on all the things we can learn from the details of this stone. And let me say very briefly that she was a Jerusalem captive because of technicalities, which I can explain in the question period. We know this stone is from the 1st century, so it is overwhelmingly the case, probable, that she was captured in Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70, when the Romans conquered the city, destroyed the temple and the city. In addition, we know from details of her name. Her name was not originally a Latin name, Claudia Aster, but was a single name because when she was captured, she became a slave. That is a fact. Most slaves in antiquity were war captives or offspring of war captives, and slavery, captivity in war and slavery immediately leveled everybody socially. So she could have been the daughter of a high priest or the daughter of a day laborer. She was captured and immediately lost all of her personality and status. But she was, but the person who put up the stone is named Tiberius Claudius, and we know, I could explain again in the question period, he was probably not her first owner, but he was her last owner because she has his name. He's Claudius and she's Claudia. He also himself happens to be a freed slave. He was a slave of the Emperor Claudius, most likely. So he also had experience of slavery. The last thing we know as a specific fact about her is that the last line of the inscription says that she died at the age of 25. And there was a Roman law, promulgated by the Emperor Augustus about 60 years before, or 7 years before she was captured, that forbade freeing slaves under the age of 30. She was 25. There are exceptions to that. I could go through them, but the one that applies to her is you can free a slave under the age of 30 to marry him or her. Augustus was trying to encourage families to repopulate the Roman Empire after a series of devastating wars. And the only one that applies to Esther. So obviously Tiberius Claudius bought her, freed her, and married her. And then she died probably in childbirth. One last point, and that is that this is what we know from the stone. And by the way, there was no reason for him to free her, other than, I think, some sentimental attachment. He could have children with her, he could have sex with her, he could do anything with her that he wanted as a slave. Also, you can triangulate. Esther was in Jerusalem in 70, and she died in southern Italy at the age of 25, somewhere in the 70s of the 1st century. So you know that she had to get from point A to point B. And you also know some of the route that people like her were carried on. So first she had to get from Jerusalem down to the port. She had to put on a ship, right, to be shipped across to Italy. So there was a long march, obviously, from Jerusalem to Caesarea, Caesarea, which is the port that she left from. And we know the route, and Lori describes this wonderfully well. What it would have been like to have been marched down to the port and then put on a ship. We also know that the ships that the Roman general Titus took from Caesarea to Rome made stops along the way, stops in order to put on amphitheater games. These were games that the Romans loved. They were the best entertainment in the Roman world, where they killed people, and so she went from well, it's on my screen, I can see it, but she went from Jerusalem down to Caesarea, and they went up the coast to Beirut and down the coast to Alexandria, and they stopped in three spots where they took slaves, Jews, off the boats and killed them in the amphitheaters, either by gladiators or animals. Esther survived that. Just to get that point, she had to survive fighting and famine in Jerusalem. Then she had to survive the very arduous boat trip to Italy. And then she had to survive perhaps abusive masters before she finally fell into the hands of Claudius. Tiberius Claudius, who fell in love with her. So by just triangulating, you can figure out where she was, she had to have been, and what she then experienced, and most importantly, survived.
Yeah, that was a beautiful retelling of it. And again, don't spoil the ending. But
Okay.
but you also just both discussed Joseph or Josephus, who
Right.
is the person that she initially was in love with and wanted to marry,
Right.
who is obviously a Jew.
Right.
But then he sort of morphs into a different character later on in the novel. And you can't decide whether he's a patriot of the Jewish people or is he a traitor to the Jewish people. So how would you sort of describe his character and how he evolves?
Mm-hmm. I love that character because it's a debate that continues today. I mean, it was crazy for the Jews with no army to declare war on Rome. And was he a realist or not? Was he trying to help his people? There's the questions that I have, the people in the first century had, and he's such a self-interest. You can't trust his history because you know that he has a bias, but that's all history. All history is written from some bias. But Jonathan, maybe you're the Josephus expert here. So
Okay. And let me just point out, first of all, yes, I have a more complex view of Josephus. The picture you're seeing is a Roman bust from the first century that has been identified by Josephus, by someone who felt we need a picture of Josephus. He's so important. There were actually statues of him in his life put up, in libraries in Rome. We don't have one, but so this unidentified bust of a young man with a beard and a big nose was identified as, he must be Jewish. He must be Josephus from the first century. So this identifies Josephus. There's really no basis other than a big nose, a beard, and bias against Jews that identifies him as Josephus. But it's nice to have a face. So let's say that was Josephus. Behind the face is a very, very complex character. A person who was many things and went through many phases of his life. I wrote my dissertation on Josephus and have lived with him, as it were, for good or bad, for many, many years, and have come really to appreciate him more than I did when I first started working on him. First of all, I should say that we are all indebted to Josephus. Call him what you will, think of what you want. He is the unique and indispensable source for so much of the history of this period, the first century, which he himself lived through. And he writes many eyewitness experiences. He is the indispensable source for our history of early Christianity, for Judaism of the first century, for Roman history, for the history of the Roman provinces. He is a very good historian. He was a sharp observer. He was a good writer, a skilled writer who did embellish now and then, first of all, to tell a good story, but second, to I would say, convey his point of view. I think that any history you write, no matter how objective you think you are being, is a point of view. Even if you have a list of facts, how you order those facts is a point of view. Josephus was an important figure in the first century. He came from one of the most aristocratic priestly families in Jerusalem, and he took part in the rebellion. He was a general in the Jewish army against the Romans. He failed. He was captured in the Galilee, and his time spent in the Roman camp sort of changed his view of things. Now, I think that Josephus started believing that we're fighting for the end of history. This is the apocalypse. I think he was one of the believers. There's no reason why a high-class educated person like Josephus should not have believed what was written in the Holy Scriptures. And I think that when he was captured and given Roman citizenship, and saw the rebellion or the war from, say, the point of view of the Roman camp, he didn't give up his belief. Josephus remained to the end of his life a deep believer in God, the Jewish God, the truth of every word written in the Bible. What he disagreed about with his fellow Jews was the interpretation of them. And I think he could not give up his belief that the Messiah will come, the apocalypse will come, Israel will prevail one day. The question is whether we got it right. And he thinks we miscalculated. It's not now. He changed his theological view. The Romans were on God's bad side. The Romans are God's instrument now. It's in fact a good thing because we have to accept God's will. He, in fact, changed not sides but views from a more, I think, fanatic view to a more moderate Jewish view, which many, many Jews agreed with. This is not the time to take up arms against the Roman Empire. God's letting his temple be destroyed is not a time, it's a sign that he wasn't with us on this. And believe it or not, after the temple was destroyed, many Jewish groups believed that that was a sign of God's insistence that the end of history is coming, and that he is going to fight on the side of the Jews, pick up his sword and fight the Jews to defeat the evil Roman Empire once and for all. That is why 60 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, we have what's called the Broadcast Revolt, another gruesomely bloody rebellion against the Romans, which of course failed. So Josephus was a believing Jew, a problematic character, definitely a self-interested person, definitely someone who wrote history in a tendentious way, but not in a completely distorting way. In other words, there are very, very few gross lies you can find in Josephus's work. He mostly tells things that are true. He does it selectively, but so does everybody else.
Right. And to also say that he was, his writings are preserved because the church preserved them. And that, I think we have to be indebted to the monks who sat in the monasteries recopying his writings and preserving them.
That is very true. In fact, it is rare for an ancient author, especially one who wrote so voluminously as Josephus. Now, don't forget that, again, this shows his dedication to the Jewish people. He wrote 7 volumes on the Jewish war, 20 volumes on Jewish history from Genesis to his day, a 2-volume work defending Jews against anti-Semites of the day, and then an autobiography. Someone who wrote so voluminously survived. That's very rare. It's because, as Lori said, of the Christian church. Now, the Christian church preserved every word he wrote lovingly for various reasons, particularly since his work seemed to confirm the prophecy of Jesus, that the temple would be destroyed and God would lose interest. And this was, for the first historian of the church, Eusebius, a main and central and unique source for not only history, but Christian theology.
And now you see, Naomi, why this book took 10 years to write.
I think each question could be its own webinar unto itself. But
and it would send me down, that would be another, 10 books to read. And we'd come back and we would discuss something else. And
I can imagine. Well, I think that just tells us that we need to have a sequel. So we'll just await the sequel for the rest of that. But we are getting so many questions from the audience in the chat. I would love to get to them all. Let's start with this one from Lisa Eisen. Hi, Lisa. In the DC area. Lori, you have 4 children. So she's wondering if you called on your own or your children's teenage years for insight into Esther's character. I assume they didn't have to go through most of what she went through in the novel, but how did you get inside, this person's mind and their emotions?
Mm-hmm. I think being the mother of four kids who are now all adults did certainly help me, imagine some of the struggles that any person goes through as they try to find their own way in the world, whatever the challenges are. My challenge as a writer was finding the time to write because of those 4 children. And I told them that the dedication that I wanted to write, but I didn't really have the nerve to do it, was I wanted to dedicate it to my family, without whom this book would have been written in 2 years instead of 10. It was very hard because of all, things that any working mother is going through to, really carve out that time. So when I think of my children in this whole process, I don't really think of them so much as an inspiration as,
as a challenge.
Yeah, they needed, the carpool, the laundry, the food. So
well, hopefully they're not watching when you say that. But also the title, Rebel Daughter, I have to ask, as Mother's Day approaches, speaking of having 4 children, and we think of this book as a potential gift to our mothers out there, some of whom are on this webinar. Why the name Rebel Daughter? I mean, is she a rebel? Like, why that choice of words?
Right. Well, that is a very good question. And I think I'll leave that one to the reader to decide after they read the book. Obviously, being a rebel in first century terms and trying to break through some of the gender norms of that time period is very different than being a rebel today. Women in antiquity were expected to be very dutiful daughters, very obedient wives, and the roles were very confined. Esther was a rebel in some ways, but again, I wanted to be historically accurate. And while there were women that wanted to learn and wanted to read, there was definitely a limit to, what they could do in that society. So I wanted to portray that. But that's a question that I think people will bring their own opinions to. And that's actually one of my book club questions in the back is, do you think the title fits? So I would be interested to know what you think after you finish the book.
Well, personally, she's not a rebellious daughter. She's very much a devoted daughter to both of her parents in the book, but she is rebellious towards, I would say, the other men in her life and the Romans and the other constructs around her. Mm-hmm. That's my take. But you do talk obviously about the rebels versus the Romans. So I like the play on words there.
Mm-hmm. And there is a mother-daughter subplot in the book.
Yep.
I think that there are a few very important female relationships that Esther has in the book that are also that were fun for me to write, and I enjoyed exploring that part.
Yeah, and to that question, someone in the audience is asking who hasn't read the book yet, what is your target demographic with this book, if you have one? Is there a certain age group, gender, nationality, language that you think would most enjoy this book?
That is a great question. And interestingly, the publisher positioned the book as, they call it a young adult crossover, because they very much wanted to get the book into the school market, into the college market. There was a need for a Jewish history book about a period other than, according to the publisher, other than like Holocaust related. So they really wanted to get this book into that market. And there is a coming of age story. But I think teens or younger readers would read the book completely different than older adults, who would see a lot more of the subtlety and the richness of the historical detail. And while I think the book can appeal to a wide audience from, say, very mature teens up until mature adults, I have to say that the vast majority of my readers are adults who love serious historical fiction. Mm-hmm. Women who enjoyed The Red Tent or The Dove Keepers, in that spirit of historical fiction. Exciting historical events told from a woman's perspective.
Right.
But again, it can technically be a great mother-daughter book club read. There's a lot to discuss for any age, but I'd say the people that relate to the book the most, and the audience I wrote for, is definitely adults.
And we also have, some people are saying that they're also reading it in book clubs that they're part of, which actually is a great idea. So bring this up to your book club.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'm happy to zoom in and love to come to any book clubs that you have. It's so exciting for me to talk about these characters who lived in my head for so long, to share them and see how other people relate to them. And the issues of forbidden love and fanaticism and women's roles. I mean, there's just such a wealth of I'd say, even contemporary topics that we can still talk about today that are from the book. Plus, there's some great food in the first century. The book clubs that I've been to, they've cooked the food that's been in the book, and on my website, I have some of those recipes, and that's been a lot of fun. So, it's a fun book club. It's a fun book club.
That's a great idea. The book does make you hungry, just hearing about the lamb and the challah and everything that they get to eat. Another question we have is whether you sort of corresponded with the archaeologists who discovered this tombstone, and whether they provided any information to you about Esther, about the bracelet that they talk about in the book, and any other aspects of the novel.
Mm-hmm. I actually did write, but I didn't hear back. Jonathan, you can probably talk a little bit about more the gravestone. It was in a museum, and it's now in the Museum of Naples.
Right. The stone was actually discovered a long time ago, and published in sort of out-of-the-way scholarly places. I came across it just when I, as Lori mentioned at the very beginning, was doing a project on a huge group of ancient inscriptions, and decided to read everything I could find. And I came across this inscription and was very immediately, I sucked in my breath and became very excited by an actual story, an actual person who lived through the things that I had been writing about from the historian's perch. But the stone, it wasn't just discovered and then we wrote about it. It actually has been known for quite a while and published. And in fact, when I wanted to see the stone many years ago, it was in the Naples Archaeological Museum. Wrote the curator, and she responded that it's somewhere in the warehouse. They don't know where it is. So it had kind of gotten lost almost in more ways than one. Then actually a new Jewish museum was opened in Italy, and it was somehow found and brought there. But then it's now, as Lori said, in the Naples Museum on display. If not for COVID, I think both of us would have gone to see it already.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And we will go see it when circumstances allow. Right.
Yeah. So anyone on the webinar who lives in Italy, go try to see it.
Go see it.
Yeah.
Go visit Esther for us. We'd love to.
Right. Exactly. Has the book been translated into other languages? There's some people on this call, native Hebrew or other speakers who want to read the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope that it will be translated. So far, the rights have only been sold in the Czech Republic, but when COVID hit, a lot of the translation rights market just stopped. I'm hoping that now it'll pick up again. Please tell your publisher, right, that you would like to see it. Your local bookstores, maybe they'll put some pressure on. I would love to see it translated for a broader audience.
Another sort of big picture question is, someone asked if people will be writing about us 1,000 years from now, or thousands of years, just like you did about the history. Do you think that will be the characters in a historical novel in the future?
Wow, that is a thought-provoking question. If I can get the rights to that question, I'd love to add that to my book club list.
You should. Yeah.
It depends on what remains of us 1,000 years from now. I mean, what I loved about the book and the whole process of Lori writing it and my taking a role in it was that it was a kind of history that I myself like to write, which is you start with one fact or text or something, and then I think within any significant artifact or text, there's a whole world to be discovered. This happened to be a particularly fascinating and rich and varied, even a traumatic world. So if there is some things discovered of us 1,000 years from now, be it a watch or a diary or something like that, sure, people will be writing what they know about us and imagining the rest. And what's interesting will be whether they imagine correctly what our lives were really like and what we were like as well. And hopefully they'll be feeling the same range of emotions we felt when we were alive on this earth.
Yeah.
That's a great question, though.
Yeah. Are there other people, now that this discovery was made, are there other people, whether novelists or archaeologists or others, who are taking this gravestone and turning it into other, creative material? What else have people done with this discovery?
Not that I know of, but if anyone would like to make a movie, please go ahead. That would be great. But so far, none that I know of.
Okay. and now that you've collaborated on this first novel together, the first for both of you, what do you see as the next step? Are you going to stay an author? Are you going to go back to business? What's your next chapter?
I would love to write another book. I feel like I learned how to become a writer at the same time I was doing all the research. And it won't take me 10 years for the next one, that's for sure. I'm kicking around a few ideas, and I'd love to write another one.
What do you have ideas of what topic or what?
I do have some ideas. Don't know whether to stay in the same time period, or I'm very fascinated by Jewish history in the South. I'm from Charleston, and I'd very much love to do a story based on my grandmother's life at the turn of the century with her 4 sisters. So I have a lot of ideas, but I haven't nailed one quite yet. I have to find a historian like Jonathan who's going to hold my hand through the history.
Jonathan, how about you? What's your next project?
Well, I'm going to, in one sense, continue to do what I've been doing all along. But what I'm doing now is I'm working on what I hope to be a large synthetic study of Civil War. This, in fact, is connected with what I worked on with Lori, which goes back to my actually doctoral dissertation. I'm interested in Civil War as a typical and recurring phenomenon in human history, and what I want to do is also break out of the ancient world and talk about Civil War as a sort of a cross-cultural, trans-chronological phenomenon, and that's what I tend to do: a large study of Civil War, hopefully to understand ourselves better and the predicaments we find ourselves in today.
Mm-hmm. And if there's more archaeological studies or discoveries like this tombstone, I mean, would that inspire you? I mean, would you like to write more historical novels or go back in time like you did with this novel again?
Well, I think I wouldn't want to be the writer, but if Lori agrees to, if there's another discovery, I would be very open to doing this. And let me say that it is not impossible at all. Excavations around the world, including Israel, bring up new material, sometimes tantalizing and fascinating material all the time. Let me just mention one site in Israel called Beit She'arim, which is a large system of burial caves with hundreds, if not thousands, of burials. And there's a lot to be discovered there. Who knows? I'm sure that buried, now it's hard to excavate there, but if someone does one day, there are probably many fascinating, moving, novel-worthy stories buried under the soil at Beit She'arim. That's just one example of many.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. A lot of people just fascinated by this discussion. So thank you to both of you for
having us. It's such an honor, and it was so much fun to talk with you about this.
No, same to both of you. And hopefully once we can travel a little more easily, we'll get to meet in person. I know that a lot of people are asking so many questions about how can they get this book. Lori, maybe you want to plug where and how people can find your book.
Okay. Well, the book is published by Random House, and it's available everywhere that you get books, the library, your local independent bookstore, Amazon, if you're overseas, Book Depository. So it shouldn't be hard to find. It's Rebel Daughter. And I hope that you do find it. And if you read it and you like it, my plug is, would you please write a review, because that really helps a lot. I'm learning a little bit about the book marketing world as well. And I realize that people love to read what other people like and what they approve of. So that's really important, if you don't mind leaving a review, if you actually do read it. But I hope you do find a copy, and I hope you read it, and that it takes you back in time, and that you find Esther's story as compelling as we did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also some people, I know I got mine on Amazon. I know people want to get the Kindle. I'm sure they can find all that.
Yes. There's also an audiobook that's fabulous.
Yeah.
Great narrator. So if you like to listen in the car, you can hear that someone read you the story.
And Lori also has a website. I don't know if you want to plug that.
LoriKaufman.com.
There you go.
And
And I'm sure you can contact her there if you, I know a lot of people are asking about having you join their book clubs where you can speak about the book and enjoy great food, hopefully in person.
I'd love to come to your book clubs. Please write me on my website or on Facebook or Instagram. You can get in touch with me and I answer everybody. And I'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both again. Again, buy this copy for your moms in advance of Mother's Day. I'll do the same. And as always, we have these webinars every Wednesday and Sunday at noon Eastern, where we feature Israeli and American experts and fascinating people like Lori and Jonathan talking about all sorts of topics. Our next webinar this Sunday at noon on Mother's Day will actually be another webinar about Jerusalem, where we feature the Jerusalem Orchestra, which is a beautiful musical group that blends East and Western music. And I'll get to be speaking with the musicians, and we'll be featuring a lot of musical takes of theirs. So looking forward to seeing you all on Sunday. For those who want to rewatch this webinar or who missed it, you can email us at webinar@aifl.org. You can also view this webinar and all of our others. We've done over 100 since last March. They are all on our website and on YouTube for free. And please share with your friends on our social media and by email. Please read this book and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thanks so much.
Tada.